we have is to go beyond such consequences and take a proactive approach to designing instruments dealing with both domains. Now, the linkages between climate change and the condition of the oceans have been recognized in a number of United Nations instruments. These include the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Rio +20 Future We Want outcome, and indeed the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Last year's Paris Agreement, the beginning of that document notes the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems, including oceans, and taking action to address climate change. Now, this inclusion of the oceans in the climate agreement is a milestone and indeed has already been cited. For example, in current negotiations on the protection of areas of the sea beyond national jurisdiction. So, taking legal action forward through the United Nations system, there are a number of initiatives currently underway and proposals seeking to bolster global collective action, simultaneously addressing both climate change and the condition of the oceans. There is no single negotiating track or international organisation capable of providing a comprehensive solution, but two legal frameworks are particularly important. One, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, and the other, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So, to mention very briefly three areas of opportunity for further cooperation. First of all, blue carbon. The phrase which refers to initiatives to bolster the ability of marine and coastal zones to serve as carbon sinks. There are a number of initiatives currently underway, with IUCN an important contributor in these. And indeed, at the Paris conference last year, a new international partnership on blue carbon was announced with the participation of IUCN to address moving to another area, to address the greenhouse gas emissions arising from shipping. There are ongoing negotiations underway under the International Maritime Organization. And indeed, at the time of this recording, a meeting is underway in London, which is considering just that. And finally, to take perhaps the most ambitious undertaking, the UN General Assembly process to design an international legally binding instrument for protection of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Climate change is an important consideration in that process too. So, in each of these processes, IUCN has been and is continuing to be an important contributor. As lawyers, our role, one of our roles, is to assist in the development of innovative legal tools to address these shared challenges. As we see in the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change and the condition of the oceans are important and overlapping challenges. I hope that together we can continue to address them in creative ways, and I would like to thank you for this opportunity and wish you all the best in your upcoming discussions.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Alain Trella. I come from France. I would like to start with an observation. We know that nature conservation is threatened by climate change. The International Union Conservation for the Nature show in a report that 25% of fauna and flora species could disappear by 2050. So the main challenge is how to integrate the climate threats in the nature conservation strategies. I propose 4 key points of legal issue. First, international environmental law should stop dedicating its efforts only on protected areas. It's essential to have a more global vision of nature and threats in order to also protect common nature. In fact, Nature conservation strategies are based on the Red List of the International Union of the Conservation of Nature. In this assessment, it should be necessary to develop a particular assessment for non-threatened species and minor concern species, particularly their dispersal capacities, because the dispersal capacities of these species determine the future status of these species. So why not create a climate impact assessment at a global scale and at a local scale after, to better know the threat and better adapt the international law and the strategies. So, because the dispersal capacity depends on the degree of fragmentation, international environmental law should take into account the protection of landscapes and the protection of soil. In France, we are developing a principle of ecological solidarity, which will consider the idea of border for the idea of network. And this is a very important point for the nature conservation. To finish, I think that states should automatically develop in the convention the principle of mutual support. It allows to take into account different objectives of different conventions of international law, and the principle of mutual support guarantees a compatible implementation of action and policies of the different conventions. Thank you very much.
So we're more than halfway through, but I can sense that there's a little bit of restlessness in the room, and we really want you to be on the ball to listen to the great presentations that are coming up. So I'll suggest that everyone has a bit of a stretch break. So could you please stand up and put your arms like that, like so. But make sure you're holding hands to the person. Thank you, your friend.
Unfortunately, I'm not able to get the sound to play on this. You can all enjoy your extra 30 seconds of break while we move to the next. Yeah, please go ahead. I spoke just after the stretch. Good morning, everyone. Bom dia. My name is Fabiano. I'm a lawyer from Brazil, but I've actually just arrived from Rome a couple of hours ago, where I work as international consultant for the UNEP. So I do hope I make sense after a night on the plane. Let's try. It's interesting actually to have the floor at this part of the colloquium, as the point that I want to make, while being of a more general nature, I think relates to a lot of what has been said so far and the more specific topics addressed. So the core of my argument is there's a need for environmental law to increasingly act as a law of sustainable development. That is, integration of environmental objectives with social and economic ones. The reason for this is related to the environmental challenge that I want to highlight today. That is, despite all the efforts to date, there is increasing degradation of natural resources, pollution, deforestation, and so on. There is unsustainable development. There's also growing recognition for the fact that the underlying root causes of unsustainable development are largely related to our failure as society to recognize and compensate the value of nature and ecosystem services, and the fact that economic activities leading to unsustainable use are permitted or even encouraged by failures and distortions in markets, laws, policies and institutions. IUCN has done a lot of work in this area. Despite the environment being a common good, there's zero incentive to use it sustainably. Now, environmental law has had primarily a target of conservation. It has, in this regard, been largely driven by a negative rationale: prevent or minimize environmental damage by command and control regulation that punish environmental harm. However, as sustainable development increasingly becomes the guiding paradigm, the ultimate guiding paradigm of our society, there's a need to shift to a logic of positive action, balancing environmental protection with economic development and social justice. Therefore, if environmental law is to address these root causes instead of remedying the consequences, it needs to enable this balance, serving as a framework for change, so not only penalizing those who pollute, but instead incentivizing sustainable use of natural resources. Just as there are efforts to mainstream environmental considerations into other regimes, such as the international trade regime and so on, there needs to be an effort to integrate environmental law with economic and social considerations. And this goes both at international and national levels. At the international level, multilateral environmental agreements need to increasingly deal with the economics behind the achievement of their goals. And I think the Paris Agreement recently is an example of that, in which I believe the carbon markets will play a key role. There also needs to be more synergies and coordination amongst different treaties, so as to avoid what is commonly called environmental leakage, carbon leakage, for instance. At the national level, the same rationale applies, and there's a need for environmental laws to enable economic incentives for sustainability. For instance, some colleagues mentioned payment for ecosystem services, but also markets for green goods and services, green fiscal policies, and so on. So in short, my point and provocation for today is we need to move towards sustainable development law with integration at its core. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Benjamin Gusson. I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Southern Queensland. My area of expertise is basically in law and economics, in particular applications of economics to constitutional law, what came to be known as constitutional economics, basically in the tradition of James Buchanan, Gordon Tullock, and others. Today I'll be presenting my paper, Jeffrow's Advice, Subsidiarity as the Essence of Sustainability. I will be following the same structure, 3 questions that were given to me by the organizers of the event, of the World Congress. So let's start. So the first point is about what's the main environmental problem. And in the paper, I elaborate on this using the idea of localism, or the construct of localism. So basically, I say that the problem today with environmental law is that it marginalized localism as the primary response to the ecological crisis. And the reason I say that is that if you look at iconic environmental law instruments such as the Earth Charter, for example, you will find that it is almost completely tilted toward the nation state. So there is a privileged, if you like, status for the nation state in relation to international environmental law, and of course the title itself, being international, says it all. This could also be formulated as saying that the problem is in relation to a link between environmental law and constitutional law. And the fact that this link is not actualized in many constitutions. Of course, there are exceptions, in particular in Latin America, for example, with Bolivia and also with Ecuador. But generally speaking, this is lacking in many constitutions. So the idea that subsidiarity is not elevated into a constitutional principle in relation to the application of environmental law generally. Now, the second point is what are the key legal issues. In the paper, I delineate this through three different angles. The first being the fiction of indigenous people. The fact that localism and its marginalization mean that local communities generally don't have the same self-organization, self-governance afforded to indigenous people. Second point is in relation to universal human rights and the fact that these rights are generally individual rights as opposed to community rights. And the third point is in relation to the complexity imperative, and this is the most important one because we became accustomed to thinking that complexity means that we have to have a hierarchy, we have to deal with it by more polarization or streamlining rather than giving effect to self-organization and allowing emergence to occur. So, how can we then solve this problem of the privilege of the nation state and the issue in relation to the link between sustainability and subsidiarity? So I say basically that we need to emphasize the principle of subsidiarity as a constitutional principle as opposed to emphasis on the principle of sustainability. Sustainability will emerge once we are able to actualize sustainability, subsidiarity as a constitutional principle that allows for self-organization. So I end on the point that subsidiarity will be actualized in things like charter cities and a new world order that takes these charter cities and makes them the building blocks of a new global approach to solving the ecological crisis. And with that, I end my presentation. My contact details are available in the paper itself. I hope to hear feedback from all of you. Thank you so much.
Good morning all. My name is Maria Modesi. I'm here all the way from Fiji, the Pacific Islands. I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. I'm really honored to be here and to be a part of the Colloquium today. My presentation, just before that, so I work with IUCN Oceania. I'm a lawyer by profession. I look after the environmental law unit, which was recently structured under the recently established Pacific Center for Environmental Governance. The presentation, I'm going to follow the structure. So what is the main environmental problem or challenge? My focus today is really to look at the establishment of environmental associations in the Pacific, and why really have we taken this approach. In the context of our biodiversity, the Pacific Islands sustain tropical forests, woodlands, grasslands, wetlands, and it has some of the highest marine diversity in the world. It also has many thousands of islands surrounded by rich, complex coastal ecosystems, including mangroves, seagrass beds, and estuarine lagoons. The region's marine and terrestrial ecosystems are also home to the world's highest proportion of endemic species. Now, the problems that we face include deforestation, increasing invasive species that continue to threaten terrestrial and freshwater species, impacts on our marine ecosystems as a result of climate change, physical disturbance, overfishing, loss of habitat, sedimentation, the competition and predation of crowns of thorn starfish, the threatened endemic species as a result of human activity. These are well identified as part of an assessment conducted by SPREP and IUCN in 2014. Now, what are the legal issues? Our legal issue really is the capacity to effectively implement multilateral environmental agreements and other environment-related international regional agreements at the domestic or the national level through the laws and policies and their proper enforcement. Now, the lack of financial and technical and human resources to allow national governments their capacity to participate in the development and implementation of these regional and international agreements. Now, in terms of technical resources, almost always there is no lawyer with a specialization of environment and natural resource law is involved in the development of these frameworks, of these legal and policy frameworks. Resource limitations have resulted in the significant gaps in environmental law and policy, and together with the significant difficulties in relation to the implementation and their enforcement. The assessment that was undertaken recently in 2014 reported that the current status of the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements at the national domestic level was poor, but it looked at the trends which was improving at the time of the reporting, that most governments were actually progressing towards legislations and policies that would implement these international regional agreements at the national level. But the real issue that we have is there's a huge gap between the implementation of the legislations and ensuring the compliance and their enforcement of the environmental offenses. Environmental law associations is part of the approach that we're taking to strengthening institutional arrangements within the region. It's not a new concept. It's also present in other regions in Europe. Australia, New Zealand have this as well. They are associations that are established mainly the approach is different in the sense that because national governments, we don't have the control of how they allocate their resources. Mostly it's not allocated to the environment departments. The environmental law associations will try to bridge that gap to help governments with technical capacity, technical assistance, capacity building initiatives in general. I only have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to go over to the areas of reforms. Now, we need law reforms, but legislations need to be localized or drafted to suit the local context if international templates are used as guidance to reforming current environmental legislations. Customary traditional laws that currently support community resource management approaches to be considered for integration into the legal and policy frameworks. We need academic institutions in the region to encourage specialized degrees in environmental governance because of the lack of lawyers that have a specialization in environmental laws. I don't have any more time, but I'll share my paper with the organization. Thank you.
For Eleanor Mitch, I have a PowerPoint presentation which we'll be able to share afterwards. And we have the audio to go. So we'll go ahead and go next to the Problem Learning Sector.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pablo Lorenzetti and I'm from Argentina. As you will note, my English is not very good, so I'm going to read some ideas about my topic in English, and then I will expand other notions in Spanish. Because we're in Brazil, when we visit Brazil, we usually speak in Portuguese. Well, the organization has structured this colloquium around 3 questions, and we have only 5 minutes to make this presentation. Then I will briefly explain these 3 ideas from my point of view below. First, I think the main problem in environmental law is the lack of effectiveness of legal norms. It's also important to highlight the fact that the international convention and agreement